In 1865, in the sweltering August heat, when the dust of the Civil War had barely settled and the wounds of a torn country were still bleeding, events took place that would be retold from generation to generation. The Reconstruction Era began its awkward dance across American soil, leaving behind widows in black mourning dresses and children who knew their fathers only from faded daguerreotypes. It was a time when the line between justice and revenge blurred like a mirage in the Texas plains, and when a woman's education could be more dangerous than any six-shooter. Do you remember the stories your great-grandmother told you about those days? When honor was measured not by the law, but by the courage to stand up to injustice, even when it came in uniform? The morning of August 15th in Cherokee County, Texas, was stifling and windless. Belle Shirley, though the world would know her as Belle Starr, stood before a cracked mirror in her humble cabin, adjusting the jet-black buttons on her velvet riding outfit. At 21, she possessed a beauty that could silence saloon patrons and make preachers forget their sermons. Her dark hair was styled in an elegant bun that would have been perfect for the salons of St. Louis, where she had spent 2 years at the Carthage Academy for Women before the war changed everything. The cabin itself told a story of lost fortune. Once beautiful furniture was now worn and patched. The Persian rug was faded from repeated washings, and the windows rattled in their frames with every gust of wind. Before the war, Shirley's family had owned a thriving hotel and stables, but Union troops had seen fit to requisition most of their livestock and burn their granaries, leaving them to live on what little remained. Belle ran her fingers over the pearlescent handle of the .45 caliber Colt hanging at her hip, a gift from her late brother Ed, who had been killed last year in a battle with Custer's gang. The weight of the weapon felt both foreign and familiar, like a prayer spoken in a half-forgotten language. Outside, the morning air shimmered, heralding another hot day. The thermometer nailed to the porch post already read 82 degrees, and the sun had barely risen above the horizon. Cicadas sang a monotonous chorus in the oak trees, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird sang its repertoire of borrowed songs. Belle's accomplices had already taken their places around the small town of Skyen, each playing their part in her carefully planned play. Tom Starr, the Cherokee bandit, who was becoming increasingly bold in his courtship of her, sprawled at the entrance to Milliken's store, carving a piece of cedar and watching the main road. His tanned face showed no emotion, but Belle knew he was as tense as a coiled snake. Frank West, barely 18 and still nursing wounded pride after serving with Terry's Texas Rangers, took up a position by the blacksmith's shop, pretending to wait for his horse to be shoed. His young face was as hollow as that of veterans twice his age, and his hands never left the twin Remington revolvers he carried low on his hips. The third member of their gang, a mysterious figure known only as Doc Morrison, though Belle suspected that wasn't his real name, had taken a room at the Skyline Hotel and spent the morning reading the week's Dallas Herald and sipping a cup of long cold chicory coffee. The information came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Abigail Hutchins, a military widow who cleaned the quarters of the Union garrison commander in nearby Dallas. Her husband had been killed at Chickamauga, and she had little love for the occupation forces that now controlled her homeland. While working, she overheard Colonel Marcus Fitzgerald talking about the monthly delivery of $15,000 in gold coins intended for troops stationed in East Texas. Belle spent weeks studying the route, calculating the patrol times, and noting every detail of the military convoy's behavior. She knew that Sergeant O'Malley always rode in front, that Private Jenkins had a habit of dozing off in the saddle in the midday heat, and that Lieutenant Crawford carried a silver flask of Kentucky bourbon, which he sipped when he thought no one was looking. More importantly, she knew they would be stopping at the Skyen Hotel for lunch, a tradition as predictable as the rising sun. At exactly 11 o'clock, Belle entered the hotel dining room. A black velvet riding dress hugged her figure in all the right places, while maintaining a dignified morning appearance that no gentleman would dare question. In her gloved hands she held a small leather volume of Tennyson's poems, and her cheeks were pinched to achieve the perfect shade of rose, which was more indicative of fragile health than of strong vitality. The dining room was filled with the quiet conversation of traveling salesmen, local merchants, and a few farmers who could afford the luxury of dining at the hotel. The furniture was sturdy, but not fancy. Heavy oak tables scarred by countless knives and spilled liquids, chairs with ladder-back seats that creaked under the weight of their occupants, and oil lamps casting dancing shadows on wallpaper that had seen better days. Belle chose a table by the window, from where she could watch the street, pretending to be absorbed in her reading. She ordered tea and cornbread, playing the part of a refined young lady traveling alone, a sight unusual enough to attract attention, but not so remarkable as to arouse suspicion. At 11:30, the jingle of harness and the rhythmic clatter of hooves announced the arrival of the Union Patrol. Through the lace curtains, Belle watched as 6 horsemen reined in their horses outside the hotel. The animals were covered in foam and red dust, which seemed to permeate everything in Texas during the summer months. Colonel Fitzgerald was the first to dismount, a thin man in his 40s with graying temples and a straight posture that betrayed his military background. Despite the heat, his uniform was ironed, and the brass buttons gleamed in the sun like little mirrors. He was followed by Lieutenant Crawford, a young man with soft features that suggested he spent more time at a desk than in the field. The soldiers remained in their saddles, rifles at the ready, though their attention was focused more on finding shade than on observing their surroundings. Belle's heart pounded in her chest as the officers entered the dining room, but her training at the Women's Academy served her well. She had learned to control her breathing, keep her hands steady, and radiate calm confidence, even when a storm was raging inside. Miss Henderson, her etiquette teacher, would have been proud of her. The officers took a table at the other end of the room, and Belle could hear snatches of their conversation as they ordered their food. They talked about troop movements, food shortages, and the difficulties of maintaining order in the conquered territory, where discontent simmered beneath the surface of polite obedience. "The locals are getting more and more sullen every day," said Colonel Fitzgerald, cutting a piece of ham that looked tough enough to be used as a boot sole. "Yesterday, someone wrote, 'Remember the Alamo,' on the courthouse wall. We had to assign 3 men to wash it off." Lieutenant Crawford nodded, trying to break a cookie that was as hard as granite. "At least they're not shooting at us anymore. Although sometimes I wonder if this silent treatment is worse than open rebellion." Belle saw her chance. Rising gracefully from her chair, she approached their table with the practiced elegance she had acquired during countless hours of etiquette lessons. Her skirts rustled softly across the wooden floor as she clutched a book of poetry to her chest like a shield. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she said, her voice betraying a hint of feminine uncertainty mixed with determination. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about the local difficulties. Would you mind sharing your experiences with me?" Both officers immediately stood up, military courtesy overriding their wariness toward civilians. Colonel Fitzgerald pointed to an empty chair at their table. "Please, Miss?" "Surely," Belle replied, sitting down with the grace of someone trained in social etiquette. "Miss Belle Shirley. I'm on my way to visit my dear aunt in Marshall, and I must confess I'm a little concerned about the safety of the roads." It was a carefully crafted lie designed to explain her presence and present her as a member of a respectable class. The mention of Marshall, a town known for its sympathy toward the Confederacy, would make her appear potentially trustworthy in the eyes of officers who dealt with hostile locals on a daily basis. Lieutenant Crawford leaned forward slightly, his youth making him more susceptible to Belle's considerable charms. "The roads can indeed be dangerous for a lady traveling alone, Miss Shirley. There are unsavory elements here. Bandits, deserters from both armies, people who have turned to lawlessness in these troubled times. Belle allowed a slight shiver to run through her body. How frightening. I've heard rumors of such things, but I hoped they were just the exaggerations of nervous gossips. Tell me, what precautions would you recommend for someone in my position? While the officers discussed the condition of the roads, patrol schedules, and safe places to stop, Belle mentally noted every detail. She learned that they planned to continue on at 2 o'clock, following an old cattle trail that ran parallel to Turtle Creek. She discovered that they were carrying not only payroll, but also dispatches, and that their next stop would be at the garrison in Tyler, another 2 days' ride to the east. More importantly, she confirmed that they were carrying the gold in leather saddlebags attached to a pack mule, information that would prove crucial to her planned robbery. Throughout the conversation, Belle played her part perfectly. She gasped at the right moments, asked innocent questions that elicited useful details, and batted her eyelashes often enough to keep the officers talking without looking indecent. At the Women's Academy, she had undergone extensive training in the art of conversation. How to extract information from men by making them feel like protectors and important figures. "You both know so much," she said, placing her gloved hand on Lieutenant Crawford's arm for a moment. "I feel much safer knowing that such dedicated officers are working to maintain order in these troubled times. My poor father, may he rest in peace, would have been comforted to know that gentlemen like you are looking after helpless women like me." The mention of her late father, another calculated move, evoked sympathy from both men. In reality, John Shirley was alive and well, sitting in their shared hut at that very moment, sipping a bottle of corn whiskey and cursing the Yankees who had ruined his business. But Belle knew that a dead father evoked more sympathy than a living one, especially when the living father was known to sympathize with the Confederacy. As dinner continued, Belle continued to weave her web of charm and distractions. When the conversation stalled, she quoted Tennyson, demonstrating her cultural education. She spoke knowledgeably about weather conditions that might affect the journey, displaying practical wisdom despite her apparent refinement. Most importantly, she expressed enough concern about the upcoming trip to elicit detailed advice about timing, routes, and precautions. By the time the officers had finished their dinner and were ready to leave, Belle had obtained all the information she needed. She knew that they would be following a trail along a stream, that they planned to camp near the abandoned farm of the widow Morrison, and that they intended to reach Tyler by Thursday evening. She also knew what they didn't know, that Tom Starr and his men were already in position along that route, waiting for her signal to spring the trap she had carefully set. As Colonel Fitzgerald and Lieutenant Crawford were about to leave, Belle stood up to say goodbye. "Thank you very much for your kindness, gentlemen. Your advice has been invaluable, and I will certainly heed your warning about traveling after dark." "You're welcome, Miss Shirley," replied Colonel Fitzgerald, touching the brim of his hat. "Have a safe trip, and give my regards to your aunt in Marshall." Belle watched from the window as the patrol mounted their horses and rode out of town, the pack mule with its precious cargo following behind like an obedient pet. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, and she could see waves of heat rising from the bumpy dirt road leading east toward their destiny. She waited exactly 10 minutes before slipping out the back door of the hotel and heading for the stable where her horse was waiting. The black mare was a beauty, 16 hands of nervous energy with a coat as shiny as polished obsidian. Belle had trained the animal herself, and they moved together like partners in a complex dance. The road to the ambush site ran through countryside that bore the scars of war like an old soldier bears his wounds. Abandoned farms with dark, empty windows were scattered everywhere, and wild cotton grass and Johnson weeds grew rampant in the fields. Vultures circled lazily overhead, and in the distance she could see smoke rising from a burning barn. The work of looters, deserters, or simply an accident. She couldn't tell. The heat was becoming unbearable. Her velvet riding suit, which had been so perfect for making an impression at the hotel restaurant, now felt like an oven. Sweat ran down her back despite her tight corset, and she could feel her carefully styled hair beginning to wilt from the humidity. But Belle Shirley had not survived the war years by giving in to discomfort. She spurred her horse on, following the trails of game and livestock that would lead her to the ambush site before the Union patrol. The spot she chose was perfect for their purposes. A narrow passage cut by Turtle Creek through a grove of oak and hickory trees. The road ran along the creek for almost a mile, with steep banks on both sides that made escape difficult for anyone caught in the open. More importantly, the place was isolated enough that the sound of gunshots would not carry to the nearest settlements. Tom Starr was already there when she arrived. His tanned face was grim with concentration as he checked his weapon for the third time. At 47, he was old enough to be her father, but there was something appealing to Belle about his quiet competence. He had been through many wars, first against other Cherokee factions, then on the side of the Confederacy, and it showed in his thorough preparation for violence. "Did they take the bait?" he asked without preamble. Belle nodded, dismounted, and checked her weapons. In addition to the pearl-handled Colt on her hip, she carried a Spencer rifle in a holster strapped to her saddle. The rifle belonged to her brother Ed, and she had spent countless hours learning to shoot it with deadly accuracy. "They'll be here in an hour," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. 6 horsemen and a pack mule, gold in leather saddlebags tied to the pack saddle. Frank West emerged from his hiding place among the trees, his young face flushed with excitement and fear. "How do we know they won't fight to the death? Those Union guys are unlikely to surrender without a fight." Belle considered this possibility carefully. "Because," she said, beginning to remove her hot velvet jacket, "they don't expect trouble from a lone woman who has just dined with them. By the time they realize what's happening, it will be too late." Doc Morrison emerged from the shadows like a ghost, his pale eyes reflecting a mind that Belle found both useful and disturbing. He carried a Sharps rifle that looked like it could take down a buffalo from 500 yards, and his movements were smooth and precise, like someone accustomed to violence. "On your marks," Belle commanded, her voice carrying the authority that came from careful planning and absolute confidence. She had spent weeks working out every detail of this operation, taking into account all unforeseen circumstances and preparing for any possible complications. The plan was elegantly simple. Belle was to take up position at the narrowest point of the gorge, looking like a lone traveler in distress. When the patrol stopped to offer assistance, as military etiquette demanded, the others would emerge from their hiding places with their weapons drawn. The element of surprise, combined with their advantageous position, should be enough to discourage any resistance. At least, that was the theory. Belle jumped back onto her horse and rode to the appointed place, where the road curved around a large boulder that served as her cover and a natural stage for her performance. She tried to look as helpless as possible, sitting sideways with her hand pressed to her forehead in obvious pain, her dark hair artfully tousled from riding over rough terrain. The wait was the hardest part. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, and insects buzzed around the horse's ears, forming crazy clouds. Somewhere in the trees, a red-shouldered hawk cried out, and Belle wondered if it was a sign. She thought of her brother Ed, who had died in the Second Battle of Cabin Creek, fighting on the side of the Cherokee Confederacy. He was 19 years old, little more than a boy who dreamed of studying law and perhaps entering politics after the war. Instead, he died on a muddy field in Indian Territory, another victim of the conflict tearing the nation apart. She thought of the war widows she knew, women like Mrs. Hutchins, who cleaned floors for her former enemies, or Sarah Matthews, whose husband had been killed at Shiloh, and who now washed clothes to feed her 3 children. The federal government offered them no pensions, no assistance, no recognition of their sacrifice. They were simply expected to endure, rebuild their lives from scratch, and pretend that their losses did not matter in the greater cause of Reconstruction. The sound of approaching hooves brought Belle back to the present. Through the trees, she saw a cloud of dust that signaled the approach of the patrol. Her heart beat faster, but she forced herself to remain calm. Everything depended on the next few minutes. The lead rider appeared first, Sergeant O'Malley, as she had expected. He was a sturdy Irish immigrant in his 30s, with a mustache that betrayed equal parts military pride and personal vanity. His blue uniform was dark with sweat, and his horse looked tired after a long ride in the midday heat. Behind him rode Colonel Fitzgerald and Lieutenant Crawford, followed by 3 soldiers and a pack mule carrying a precious cargo. The animals were tired, their heads bowed, and the men looked no less exhausted from the harsh Texas sun. Belle waited until they had completely entered the narrow passage, and only then did she act. She spurred her horse, swaying slightly in the saddle, as if overcome by heat or nausea. "Oh, please!" she cried, trying to make her voice sound distressed, but not theatrical. "Please, help me!" The patrol stopped immediately. Sergeant O'Malley's hand instinctively reached for his weapon, but Colonel Fitzgerald gestured for him to refrain. Military protocol was clear regarding assistance to civilians in distress, especially ladies with obvious signs of high birth. "Miss Shirley?" exclaimed Lieutenant Crawford. "What are you doing here?" Belle allowed herself to drop dramatically forward, pressing her palm to her forehead. "Oh, Lieutenant Crawford, thank goodness. I'm afraid I took a wrong turn somewhere. My horse lost a horseshoe, and I've been wandering around in this terrible heat for hours." It was a masterful performance, using all the techniques she had learned over the years. Her voice had notes of feminine helplessness mixed with relief at seeing familiar faces. Her posture suggested that she was about to collapse, and her clothes, artfully disheveled during the ride, reinforced the story of misfortune and distress. Colonel Fitzgerald immediately dismounted, his natural chivalry overcoming his military caution. "My dear young lady, you look completely shaken. Jenkins, bring some water from the flask." While the soldiers crowded around her anxiously, Belle noticed movement in the trees. Tom Starr was the first to jump out, aiming his rifle at Sergeant O'Malley. A moment later, Frank West appeared, covering the soldiers, followed by Doc Morrison with a Sharps rifle aimed at Colonel Fitzgerald's back. "Nobody move!" Tom Starr's voice cut through the afternoon air like a knife. "Hands where we can see them, and no one will get hurt." The transformation in the clearing was instantaneous and dramatic. The tired, heat-exhausted soldiers suddenly became alert and dangerous, their hands reaching for their weapons, but they froze at the sight of 3 rifles aimed at them with deadly precision. Colonel Fitzgerald's face turned pale with shock and rage. "Miss Shirley, what is this? Are you in league with these bandits?" Belle straightened in the saddle, all feigned concern evaporating like morning mist. When she spoke, her voice had a steely firmness that would have struck her former instructors at the Women's Academy. "I am Belle Shirley, Colonel, and these people are my comrades. We have come for the pay you are carrying, and I strongly advise you to hand it over without resistance." Lieutenant Crawford looked as if he had been struck by lightning. But you're a lady. You quoted Tennyson." "I can quote Shakespeare, too," Belle replied coldly, smoothly and precisely, drawing her pearl-handled Colt. "But I think the situation calls for something more direct than poetry." The tension in the air was palpable. 6 Union soldiers, tired and caught off guard, stood before 4 determined criminals who had the advantage of position and the element of surprise. The only sounds were the buzzing of insects, the distant cry of a hunting hawk, and the heavy breathing of horses being driven in the brutal heat. Sergeant O'Malley's hand jerked toward his weapon. "You won't get away with this, miss. Less than 6 hours away, a whole company of cavalry is retreating." Belle smiled, and there was not a trace of warmth in her smile. "Then I suggest we get this over with quickly. Colonel Fitzgerald, order your men to dismount and surrender their weapons. The choice is simple: your gold or your lives." The colonel's military training conflicted with his practical assessment of the situation. He was responsible for the lives of his men as well as their pay, and the odds were clearly not in their favor. 4 rifles against 6 pistols might seem quite surmountable, but the bandits had the advantage of position and training. "Do as she says," he finally said, his voice tinged with the bitterness of defeat. "Get off your horses and drop your weapons." One by one, the soldiers obeyed. Pistols, rifles, and even pocket knives were laid on the ground, and Belle's accomplices held them at gunpoint. The pack mule, sensing the tension, snorted nervously and tried to move away from the crowd. Frank West approached to collect the saddlebags containing the gold, his young hands trembling slightly as he unfastened the leather straps. The weight of the bags, nearly 20 kilograms each, was evidence of their contents. $15,000 in gold eagles, Belle said, more to herself than to anyone else. Enough to change a lot of lives. Colonel Fitzgerald looked at her with something like admiration mixed with disgust. "You planned this all along, didn't you? The meeting at the hotel, the questions about the roads, it was all calculated." Belle nodded, holstering her weapon, while Tom Starr and the others continued to watch her warily. "Every word, Colonel, although I must say that you and Lieutenant Crawford were very helpful with your detailed descriptions of the route and schedule." "What now?" Lieutenant Crawford asked, his voice sounding hollow with shock. "Are you going to kill us all?" The question hung in the overheated air like a physical presence. Belle had carefully considered this moment during her planning, knowing that the decision she made here would determine her fate forever. By killing the soldiers, she would get rid of witnesses and reduce the chances of being pursued. But she would also become a murderer, not just a thief. "It's up to you, gentlemen," she finally said. "I have nothing against you personally, and I don't enjoy violence for violence's sake. But if you pursue us, if you force us to defend ourselves—" She didn't finish the threat. Doc Morrison stepped forward, his pale eyes reflecting something that looked like pleasure. "About 3 miles north of here, there's an old cabin. It's been abandoned since the war. Perhaps it would be a good place for the gentlemen to wait until we've gone further away." Belle understood immediately. Imprisonment instead of murder was a solution that served their purposes and allowed her to retain some moral authority. "An excellent suggestion, Doc. Colonel, you and your men will accompany us to the cabin, where you will remain our guests for a day. That should be enough time for us to disappear." The road to the abandoned cabin wound through rural countryside that told the story of a region ravaged by war. They passed burned-out farms, abandoned fields where cotton plants struggled against weeds, and sparse, unmarked graves topped with simple wooden crosses. The hut itself was a testament to shattered hopes and unfulfilled dreams. Built sometime in the 1850s by an optimistic settler, it had been abandoned when the war made life on the frontier too dangerous. The roof sagged menacingly, daylight shone through the cracks between the logs, and the door hung on leather hinges. But it would suit their purposes. "Come in, gentlemen," Belle ordered, dismounting and checking his weapon one last time. "It's simple inside, but it will do for your needs." When the soldiers entered the hut, Colonel Fitzgerald stopped and looked back at her. "Miss Shirley, or whatever your real name is, you do realize that this won't be the end of it. You will be hunted down until the end of time." Belle met his gaze firmly. "Perhaps, Colonel, but some things are worth the risk." Tom Starr secured the cabin door with a long rope so their captives couldn't escape until they found a way to free themselves, or were discovered by another patrol. Belle estimated that, in any case, the criminals would have at least 12 hours to hide in the vast expanse of East Texas. Returning to their hideout, they drove through a landscape painted gold and crimson by the setting sun. The stifling heat finally began to subside, and a light breeze rustled the leaves of the oak trees growing on the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang the evening hour, reminding them that normal life continued even as they raced toward an uncertain future. Plans and possibilities swirled in Belle's head. $15,000 was more than most Texans earned in a lifetime. With the right investment, that money could buy land, livestock, and even political influence. It could start a new life in California or Mexico, far from the federal authorities. But as they approached their temporary camp, Belle's thoughts took a completely different turn. The camp was hidden in a grove of walnut trees near a small stream that provided both water and shelter. Tom Starr had chosen the location well, close enough to the main roads for gathering intelligence, but isolated enough to avoid unwanted attention. As they divided the gold by the light of the campfire, Belle made a statement that stunned her companions. "I'm keeping half," she said, lifting one of the heavy leather bags. "The rest is for the widows." Frank West looked up from the coins, his young face reflecting his confusion. "What widows?" "War widows," Belle replied without a hint of hesitation. "Women whose husbands died fighting for the Confederacy. The ones the federal government has forgotten. The ones who scrub floors and wash clothes to feed their children." Tom Starr looked at her with his dark, piercing eyes. "That's almost $8,000, Belle. You could buy half of Cherokee County with that kind of money." "And what good would that do?" Belle snapped. "Land doesn't ease suffering. Land doesn't feed a widow or clothe her children." Doc Morrison remained silent during the conversation, methodically cleaning his rifle with professional thoroughness. Finally, he looked up. "A generous gesture, Miss Belle, but a dangerous one. Start handing out stolen money to Confederate widows, and people will start talking. Talk leads to rumors, and rumors lead to legends." Belle smiled in response, and there was as much determination in her smile as there was recklessness. "Let them talk, Doc. Let them tell their stories. Maybe it's time for this country to have some new legends. Stories about people who fought against injustice, who remembered their own when the government forgot them." Over the next few weeks, Belle kept her promise. Traveling under assumed names and using elaborate disguises, she visited Confederate widows throughout East Texas. She left Mrs. Sarah Matthews in Tyler $100 hidden in a flour sack. She anonymously paid off the mortgage of Mrs. Johnson in Marshall, which would have cost the woman her farm. She provided dozens of others with the means to live with dignity in a world that seemed determined to drive them into poverty. The story spread like wildfire through the communities of East Texas. The mysterious benefactor became known as the Velvet Angel, in honor of Belle's distinctive black riding outfit and her habit of appearing and disappearing like a character from a fairy tale. Federal authorities launched an intensive investigation, but Belle covered her tracks too well. During her education at the Women's Academy, she studied languages, geography, and etiquette, which served her well in maintaining her elaborate deception. She spoke French well, knew Latin well enough to quote classical authors, and possessed a cultural knowledge that allowed her to blend into high society when necessary. Even more important, she enjoyed the absolute loyalty of the communities she served. Confederate veterans and their families rallied around the Velvet Angel, creating a protective network that federal investigators found impossible to penetrate. The legend grew with each new story. Some said she was the ghost of a Confederate officer's wife, seeking justice from beyond the grave. Others claimed she was a wealthy Northern sympathizer who had had a change of heart. Some whispered that she was actually several women working together to create the illusion of a single mysterious figure. Belle encouraged all these stories, instinctively understanding that legend could be more powerful than facts. The more mysterious and elusive the Velvet Angel became, the more she captured the imagination of people desperately in need of heroes during a time of defeat and occupation. By the fall of 1865, her fame had spread beyond Texas. Newspapers, even in cities as far away as New York and Chicago, were full of stories about a mysterious criminal who robbed the government and gave her loot to Confederate widows. Some portrayed her as a romantic figure, a Southern belle turned Robin Hood. Others condemned her as a dangerous criminal threatening the peace of Reconstruction. Belle read these stories with a mixture of pleasure and unease. Fame was a double-edged sword. It could protect her thanks to the support of the people, but it also made her a more valuable target for ambitious law enforcement officials. The end came, as it often does, as a result of betrayal and bad luck in equal measure. On a cold December morning, Belle visited the home of Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, the widow of a soldier who had died at Gettysburg. She brought Christmas presents for the woman's 3 children, dolls and toy soldiers bought in Dallas with Confederate gold, and was drinking coffee by the fireplace when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the frozen window, she saw the mouths of Federal cavalry surrounding the cabin. At the head of the troop rode Colonel Fitzgerald, his face grim with determination and satisfaction at finally completing the long hunt. Belle's hand instinctively reached for the pearl-handled Colt, but she stopped herself. Mrs. Hartwell's children were in the cabin, and Belle did not want to risk their safety for her freedom. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said quietly, "please take the children to the back room and keep them there until this is over." The old woman's eyes filled with tears, but she gathered the children without protest. At the door, she paused and looked back. "God bless you, Miss Belle. Whatever they say about you, we will never forget what you have done for us." Belle waited by the fireplace while Colonel Fitzgerald and his men entered the cabin. He looked older than she remembered, worn out by months of chasing a shadow through the Texas wilderness. "Miss Belle Shirley," he said formally, "or should I call you the Velvet Angel? You are under arrest for robbery, theft, and conspiracy against the government of the United States." Belle straightened her shoulders and met his gaze. "I am Belle Shirley, Colonel, and I surrender to you. But I want you to understand that Mrs. Hartwell and her children knew nothing of my actions. They are not guilty of anything." Colonel Fitzgerald nodded reluctantly. "Your concern for others is noted, Miss Shirley. Although, I must admit, I am curious. What led a well-educated young lady to a life of crime?" Belle smiled, and the same enigmatic expression that had charmed him in the hotel dining room many months ago appeared on her face. "Perhaps you could say that I was too well educated, Colonel. I was taught to think for myself, to question authority, and to stand up for what I believe is right. Perhaps that was their mistake." As the soldiers placed shackles on her wrists, Belle took one last look around the modest cottage. Mrs. Hartwell's children stared at her from the doorway of the back room, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. The Christmas presents she had brought lay scattered on the rough wooden table, bright spots amid the winter gloom. "Take care of them," she whispered to Mrs. Hartwell, knowing that her words had a meaning that went beyond the current situation. The trip to the federal court in Dallas took 2 days through the frozen countryside. Belle rode in silence, already forming plans for escape or, if that failed, a strategy for the trial. During her education, she had studied law and rhetoric, skills that could be useful to her in court. More importantly, she knew that her arrest would only reinforce the legend of the Velvet Angel. She could already imagine the stories that would spread through the Confederate communities of Texas. How she had surrendered to avoid endangering innocent children. How she had met her capture with dignity and courage. When the trial finally took place, it caused a sensation that attracted attention throughout the South. Belle conducted her own defense, using her classical education to construct arguments that impressed even hostile observers. She pleaded guilty to robbery, but argued that her actions were justified by the federal government's disregard for the widows and orphans of war. "Gentlemen of the jury," she said in her closing statement, "I stand before you not as a common criminal, but as a person who refused to sit idly by while people were suffering around her. Yes, I took money that belonged to the United States government, but I gave it to women whose husbands died serving what they believed was right, women who were forgotten by the very country they helped build." The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Belle was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, but she had already achieved something more valuable than freedom. She had become a symbol of resistance against an unjust system.